So it's not surprising to see within our own society that our society is structured way more around the concept of utilitarianism than it is this idea of justice or fairness that Dworkin, Sen, and Rawls are laying out for us. Um, uh, you know, utilitarianism is great as long as you benefit. So it's not really personally threatening to the advantaged as much as it is to the disadvantaged. And once those people that gain advantage in a utilitarian society, it's really hard for them to lose their advantage. And once you are delivered a position of disadvantage, it's difficult to escape the disadvantaged position, even though the rhetoric within our society and our social values says that economic mobility and moving from one class to another is still a possibility. And we can also assume that the advantaged are less likely to envision environmental problems, and because of that, they're less likely to throw social power against those problems. So if the advantaged live in gated communities that are far from the pollution that is impacting many of the poor populations, then they're less likely to understand the impacts of those polluted environments, and they're also less likely to do anything about it. That leads us to this idea that our society is really a representation of inequality, especially in relationship to social power. We see this in the consequences of our own environmental realities, how those social bads tend to concentrate in those populations with less power, and the social goods tend to concentrate in those that have more power. And we see that in the ability of someone to exercise control over their social world, which is exercising social power. And social power is not always bad. We need social power in order for us to exercise some control over our life. But when we get caught up in systems of inequality, those inequalities play out in representation to the distribution of the goods and bads of society and the productions of our society. This leads us to this idea of utilitarian as democracy, which is something that we see in today's society. It usually feels democratic. A good example of this is that you're voting on a proposed community action, and the community action passes 65% to 35%. Well, that feels very democratic, but that still leaves us with 35% of the population not receiving what they wanted. And that creates these problems of equal that we see in reference to equal concern. What does the people that didn't get what they want think? And do we need to do something to accommodate their wishes as well? So these inequalities in a people's ability to influence what is voted on, or what those who voted for do with those offices, really creates this problem that utilitarianism delivers to democratic forms of governance. In these types of systems, equality in political standing depends in part on equality of material standing and vice versa. So if you have a lot, you're most likely going to get a lot from the system. If you don't have a lot, you're most likely not going to get a lot from the system. This reality of utilitarianism was a major concern for Rawls, as we talked about initially. That's why Rawls was seeking for a justice and a fairness within our society that distributed the social goods and social bads equally to each person, no matter what their standing is. And of course, Sen and Dworkin follow in the footsteps of Rawls, and so they say what we really have is a democracy based on inequality, and what we really want is a democracy based on equality. And so what they're looking for is democracies that produce equalities in both the political and the material realms, and a democracy in which concerns of everybody and everybody are concerns of everybody and everybody. The social goods and social bads are being distributed to everybody, no matter who they are, therefore making everybody concerned about those social goods and social bads. The last thing that the chapter really gets us to think about, and this is something that's talked about in Annie Leonard's The Story of Cosmetics, is the precautionary principle, which essentially means thinking, behaving, and regulating in ways that prevent problems from happening down the road. So if justice requires accounting for and fighting oppression, inequality, and inadequate participation and capabilities, then the precautionary principle supplies a guiding framework for institutionalizing environmental justice within regulatory practice. So err on the side of caution. If you think that there is potential problems that could be the outcomes of a set of policies, then don't engage with the policies. Err on the side of caution. And if we do that, then we're less likely to produce the social bads that then end up being distributed unequally in a democracy based on the assumptions of utilitarianism. At the end of the chapter, we always want to make some connections. The central issue in this chapter focuses in on the body and its connections to the in environment and the en environment, and why that is important. Once we start getting into the chapter, we quickly see the connections of our bodies with the world, especially when we consider matters of justice in the environment. And we talked a little bit about NIMBY, or not in my backyard, and it becomes truncated a bit as NIM, or not in my body. And that gets us to think about how justice gets us past utilitarian turmoil by not in anybody's backyard and not in anybody's body, unless it is in everyone and everybody's advantage. So we don't do things that deliver social bads to somebody if everybody doesn't benefit from that. And if we embrace democracy based on egalitarianism, it's going to redistribute the goods and the bads of society, and it's going to change the way that we ultimately make decisions about the world that we live in.